Did you know that if you were to look at the gospel according to John, you would find that the final week of Jesus' ministry takes up nearly half of the entire gospel account? And during that final week, you see these profoundly important events that Jesus is engaged in. You have Palm Sunday with Jesus' triumphant entry into the city of Jerusalem, where he's hailed as king. And then on Monday, you have his interactions in the temple, where he's flipping the tables of the money changers and knocking over chairs and driving out the people that were conducting business. Right? He's cleansing and he's purifying his temple. And then you get to Tuesday, and Tuesday just appears to be a standard day for Jesus. It's business as usual. He's just teaching. Right? We see Jesus on Tuesday teaching parables like the two sons and the evil farmers and the great feast. And you see him interacting with the religious leaders and his authority to do and say things being challenged. It just seems like a normal Tuesday for Jesus. But here's the thing. Each and every one of those parables and the words that Jesus speaks, and even in his interactions, they have profound meaning leading up to the events that conclude the week. Take, for example, the interaction that Jesus has with the Sadducees. The Sadducees, they were a sect of first century Judaism, and they were wealthy, they were powerful leaders, and they had two central beliefs. The first central belief is that they held that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, that those alone were the inspired writings of God. And their second central belief is that they believed that there was no such thing as the resurrection. And so they come to Jesus and they present him with this hypothetical scenario that according to the law of Moses, they say, that a man, if he dies without having any children, then the brother of the man should marry the widow and have a child to carry on the brother's name. And so the Sadducees present this hypothetical situation that there's 7 brothers. Suppose there's 7 brothers. The first of the brothers marries and dies, has no child. The second brother then marries the widow, has no child, dies. The third brother marries the widow, and so forth, all throughout all of the brothers. And then they close off the scenario by saying, now in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Because she was married 7 times. And so they try to trip up Jesus and his theology, and Jesus instead just flatly tells them that you're wrong, that you're mistaken. And you're mistaken because you do not know the scriptures nor the power of God. And I want you just to picture that for a moment. I mean, these are religious leaders of the time. They have read the Torah. They read the Torah. They've studied the Torah. They've memorized the Torah. And here's Jesus saying that you are wrong, right? You're mistaken because you don't know the scriptures. He's essentially saying you're wrong because you don't know what you've spent your entire life studying. And so what Jesus does is he answers their hypothetical situation with a very simple sentence answer in verse 30. And then he goes on in verse 31 to really get to the heart of the question regarding resurrection. And so this is what it says in Matthew 22:31 and following. It says, Jesus says, "But now, as to whether there will be a resurrection of the dead, haven't you ever read about this in the scriptures? Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." See, what's fascinating about that answer is that Jesus appeals to the Torah. He appeals, knowing who he's talking to, the Sadducees, to the portions of Scripture that they hold as the only ones inspired of God. And he says, haven't you read what it says in the Torah, the Scriptures? That long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's present tense. It's continuous. He continues to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob long after they've died. And then he caps off his teaching and his reply to the Sadducees by saying, God is not the God of the dead. He is the God of the living. See, Jesus implies that because of God's covenant faithfulness, that because of God's covenant love, the patriarchs of Israel, though they have died, they are still very much alive with him. That Jesus is inferring that they are still with the God of Israel, that God remains to this day their God. I began to think about that and the hope that we have in the resurrection. Right, the hope of resurrection is not just about having a happy ending to our story here on earth. Right, resurrection hope is a hope that was born long ago and revealed in the Old Testament. Resurrection hope is a hope that says that Yahweh will not let sin and death, will not let evil and suffering have the victory. That because of his covenant love for his people, because of his covenant faithfulness, God will not allow the evil and the suffering and the sin and the death that was a result of the fall of man in the garden to have the final word. Sin and death do not have the final word. And that is and should be a great hope for us. And that's something that I think we should all take time today on Tuesday to remind ourselves of, especially given the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the situation of COVID-19 and the fear and the worry and the anxiety over sickness and death that is consuming so much of our lives right now. That our hope is not rooted in anything of this world. Our hope is not found in anything of the temporal world that we find ourselves in. Our hope is rooted in God, who is a God not of the dead, but a God of the living. That as his people, our hope is found in him. Our covenant-keeping God, who has acted decisively and definitively to defeat sin and death, evil and suffering. And he has done it through the life, the death, and the resurrection of his Son, Jesus the Christ. That, my friends, regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, is a great hope to latch onto. Rejoice in that hope, rest in that hope, and find yourself cherishing and holding on to the promises of our faithful God. God bless you. God be with you. And I'll see you on Easter Sunday.